Hello everyone and welcome to this video on maybe not a very good chess opening, but one of the chess openings. It's the Latvian Gambit. So for anyone unsure of what that is, the Latvian Gambit goes e4, e5, knight f3, and instead of, knight c6 or, I don't know, d6, maybe knight f6, we go with f5. Now what's the point of f5? If you look at it, it's essentially a King's Gambit, but with colors reversed. So the King's Gambit goes e4, e5, and f4. So it's just the King's Gambit with colors reversed. Now there are a few key lines that I'm going to go over today. These are really the few lines you need to know to play the opening. So the first part of this video is going to be on knight takes e5. That's the most critical line, and it's considered the refutation by modern standards of theory. But you'll be fine. So aside from knight takes e5, the second part of this video is going to be covering the alternatives. So that's stuff like e takes f5, bishop c4, and d3. Those are really the other common moves. So without further ado, let's get started with knight takes e5. Now knight takes e5 is critical for a number of reasons. For one, there is a threat of going queen h5 and attacking the king. It's also considered the most effective method of countering the Latvian because you don't get the e4 push to displace the knight. The knight has just taken your free pawn. There are a number of options here for black. Knight f6 is vaguely playable. Knight c6 is also kind of playable, but today I'll be going over the main line, queen to f6. And now you can see a lot of arrows because essentially I've put all of the common ideas into this one kind of page. But you don't have to worry, it'll all make sense eventually. So what are we looking at exactly here? Number one, the queen. Now you notice that the queen is kind of misplaced, right? It's blocking our knight, and with our knight in the way, we can't castle. So one of the common ideas is to move our queen either to g6 or f7, getting it out of the way for the knight to develop. I mean, of course, we can't do that now, we would lose our queen. Another idea of moving our queen here is, of course, to allow g6. So if, let's say, white played queen h5, g6 would be fine. Aside from that, another common idea is to play knight c6, attacking the center squares if they ever play d4. We will look at a line where this comes into play later. We'll also be developing our knight to f6. This bishop will kind of stay here or go to e7 so that we can castle. This bishop and this knight on f6 are going to be looking at this key g4 square. This square is where a lot of black's attacks and really tactics will come from, along with the open f-file. On the queen side, black can try for a6 and b5, c6 and d5 or c5. There are a number of options and we'll go through all of them. So without further ado, let's move on to the actual theory. So, knight takes e5, queen f6. And we're going to start with d4 here. There are other options that I'll cover later. But essentially but d4 is the most common move by, let me just show you guys the statistics. d4 is the most common move by about 80%. So d4, and of course we play d6 here, attacking the knight, kicking it back. And now white has a number of choices on where the knight goes. The true refutation of the Latvian Gambit is knight to d3, and I'll tell you why later. But the most common move by about 70% is knight to c4. It's a very natural move, continuing to exert some sort of pressure on center squares and allowing the other knight to come to c3. So of course we just take the pawn back. Okay, we are no longer down a pawn, but we are down tempo. A lot of our play from now on is going to revolve around tempo play. If black can successfully get the initiative, black is probably winning. So knight to c3, most common move, attacking the central pawn. And here's the first key idea I showed you just now, queen to g6. Not only does this move defend the pawn on e4. It also opens up a square for our knight, and these are I've just highlighted the squares where our pieces usually go. So from here, black has a 47% win rate, which is already pretty good considering the opening. And it's actually on par with a lot of other common openings for black. I'm going to analyze a few moves just based on the most popular moves in the database. The most popular move is Queen e2, which makes sense. It's attacking the center pawn, but it's not great because already we can play Knight f6. We're defending the center, and we've already got a great position. Do note, however, that d5 is not a very great move in all respects. Not only is it free right now, but white gets knight e5. And as I said just now, if black can get the initiative, black is probably winning. But the opposite applies as well. If white gets the initiative and a free knight in the middle, white is probably going to be doing really, really well. So let's note that this d6 pawn is doing a very good job of keeping the knights out of our position. So after knight f6, defending our central pawn, f3 is the most popular move after that. It makes sense attacking the pawn, and black's king is currently in the middle, so it is a little bit dangerous for us. So here I'm going to recommend bishop to e7. Bishop to e7 just breaks the pin, and we're going to castle next. So of course white plays f takes e4, and we just castle. We are going to win this e4 pawn back eventually, or white is going to get a really, really bad position. For example, let's say white plays like a natural developing move, bishop to e3. Already we win the pawn back. That's it, it's just another pawn. Fantastic. So let's say white really wants to hang on to the pawn. Okay, so white plays something like bishop to d2, which is a really common move. We're going to go with knight c6. An alternative here is bishop to g4, but it's not as great, and I'm going to explain why. Essentially, every move you want to create threats. And so let's see what happens after bishop to g4. Queen goes to e3, and you notice it's defending the d4 pawn. Whereas if we were to go knight c6 and attack the pawn, let's say the queen goes here, we have knight g4, which just wins on the spot. But essentially what happens after bishop g4, queen to e3, now knight c6 doesn't do anything because we're not attacking we're not actually attacking anything. White can try and consolidate with something like bishop e2 and castling in one of the directions. So I do recommend knight c6 here, and just, you know, as a fun fact, black is completely winning. I'm just going to show you the eval bar. It's at minimum -1, but any of the top like 4 most common moves instantly lose the game. So let's say d5. d5 is the most common move by far, and you see the eval bar just go sky high. No, but why is that? Okay, so let's look at what happens next. We're going to go with bishop to g4 first. Knight d4 is okay. Knight b4 is also fine, but there's a reason we start with bishop to g4, and the reason is that look at that queen. It hasn't really got anywhere good to go. White can already instantly lose the game with queen to d3, knight b4, hitting the queen, and there is no way to not lose that pawn and the rook. Alternatively, white can try and go here and instantly lose the game as well. So white literally has one move, which is queen to e3. After queen to e3, we're going to go knight b4 anyways, attacking the pawn, threatening to do the world's nastiest royal fault. So again, let's recap that line. Here, we've already played knight c6, yes? So to gain initiative, we start with bishop g4. It's a very good move to remember. Queen e3, only move that doesn't lose a queen, and knight to b4. White really only has one move that doesn't lose on the spot, because again, white can't castle due to our bishop. So Bishop to d3, really the only move that can maybe hang on to this pawn for a while, but white is already completely lost. Why? Because this king is just not going anywhere. These pieces are all doing absolutely nothing, and black has every piece developed for the cost of like one pawn. So here a number of moves are possible. There's knight h5, but I'm going to cover knight d7 here. The point of knight d7 is that, let's say we may play a nothing move. Already white can try and break out with e5. And it's still, as you can see from the eval bar, still winning for black, but it complicates the game a lot, and frankly, no one wants to deal with the complications. So we're going to go with knight d7 for the simple reason that it defends e5 and also opens up our rook, preventing white from maybe trying to castle kingside. It also prepares our knight to go to c5, where it's going to exert more pressure on maybe that bishop. And in general, opposition is already looking really, really good. Let's say, white plays a3. Like, what else is white going to do? Because white can't castle either direction, and white also, white literally cannot move anything else. So a3 is a logical move, yes. We're just going to snap that off. And there are two options. We can go knight c5. Knight c5 is a good move. But if you want some immediate tactical complications, bishop h4 just wins the game. The king can't go here, the king can't go here. This just loses the game. I hope everyone can see that. So g3 is the only move. And here we're going to play this really funny. Rook to f3. And white has to give up the queen in a really funny sequence of moves I'm going to show you. Queen to e2, only place that doesn't immediately lose. Although maybe... anyways, let's say queen e2. He takes pawn, and this is mate. So essentially white has to sacrifice that queen with something like gh in order to maybe not get mated immediately. So that's just a really funny variation. So let me just go back over that line one more time. We start with knight c6. Knight c6 attacks the pawn, and most importantly leaves this square flexible, so that if they go here, we can win the game. Let's say queen g1, you win a rook. I can't do much better than giving you a free rook. Yeah, queen here, again loses. Queen back, also loses. So I can't give you much better than that. So we're going to start with knight c6, and here I covered d5. So d5, bishop g4, very important move, gaining time on the queen. We want to create a threat and attack something every single move. Because we're down a pawn, we've got to create initiative, yes? Queen e3, the only move, because here, immediately lose. Queen e3, threaten the fort, after they defend, knight d7. Very important move, I'm going to give it a good move sticker. Knight d7 prevents the king from castling, controls e5, and prepares knight to c5. So let's say a3 takes, and here bishop h4 tries to clarify like problems immediately. Look at f3, you're completely winning, mate. So let's move back. Here I covered pawn to d5. Just find it. Yes, here I covered pawn to d5. There are a number of other moves. For example, they all lose though. For example, this is the most common move, which immediately loses the game on the spot. Bishop to e3 loses this pawn. And of course, it's really not much to cover. Oh, castles also loses a rook. So you can see that there are just insane amounts of tactics every single move. And in this one move alone, I mean, white's already dead lost. So that's, I think, enough for this line. We can go back a little bit. So essentially the key mistake here from white was actually queen to e2, because it's kind of a waste of time. So I'm going to analyze a few other moves. For example, bishop to e2. Bishop to e2 has a very funny threat, being I want to win your queen. Yes, you see the queen can be pinned to our king. So we start with knight f6. Okay, just defending that square. After they castle, another key defensive idea is h5. And I know h5 looks really funny and kind of stupid, but you have to think about it as like, if we give white any more time to have an initiative, we are going to die. Because let's say, for example, if white tried this, we lose the queen, lose game. Of course, here this is fine because we can take on g2. But essentially, what I want you to watch out for is all these diversions that can happen to remove our knight. And once the knight is removed, we lose our queen. So we play h5. And the point is we are going to move our bishop, get castle, and now we can move the queen. Right, so something like this no longer works because the rook now defends the key h5 square. Very important. Before they castle, these funny things are nothing to worry about. For example, you have queen takes here, and you're just completely winning. So aside from the funny bishop e2 threat, again, this can happen in a number of lines, transpositions and everything. So bishop e2 is just a move you need to watch out for. Especially with our queen on g6, which is a really dangerous square. So other than bishop e2, another common move is bishop to e3. Bishop to e3 doesn't really make a lot of sense. We can just go knight f6 and move on with life, play bishop g4, knight c6, get a nice position, same thing. Yeah, really normal looking position. I did want to show another common idea here, which is after g3, which was an inaccuracy played in the game, c6. This c6 d5 idea, as I outlined very briefly in our introduction, is another common idea that you might have to employ in Latvian. In this case, since your knight can no longer come to c6, you'll put it on d7, maybe play for c5, maybe put it on b6. Alternatively, you could try and play for a6 and b5 because the king's on the queen side, so you might as well throw some pawns this way. I've left the full game in the study, but it's good to know. Another common alt move here is h4. h4 is a little bit scary, but as much as it is scary, there's no real threat. Again, you can just go with c6. You know, if they go h5, just queen f7, you're fine. b5 is fine. You can also go b5 here, also d5. Both are fine. This is a game between I believe, 2000s that proceeded very well. And after this, I mean, black is already fine, although this pin is a bit concerning. Eventually, black would go on to lose this game because here, literally just take the pawn. Instead, black decided to blunder the whole house, and white eventually promoted and won. So, but of course, that's just a full game that I'm not going to really get into. The key idea is, of course, c6 and d5, or a6 and b5 for queenside play. So moving on, another common move other than bishop queen to e2 and bishop to e3 is this knight to e3 move. Sorry, knight to e3. And after knight f6, we're fine. If they try bishop e2, there's not really anywhere else for bishop to go. Bishop e7. This is a horrendous move because again you hang your queen. But of course you don't have to take. You can go bishop to d8, castle, and be like, okay. But of course, if you're scared, after bishop bishop e2, you can of course go h5 as I showed you just now. Moving forward, that's pretty much all we have to cover in the knight c4 line. Just actually, you know what? I'll do a summary for the knight g4 line. Again, queen comes to g6, gets out of the way of our knight, prepares for our king to castle and everything to develop, and also prepares to move something to this g4 square. After queen e2, a common idea to note is knight c6. Knight c6, and this general principle of creating a threat every move after something like bishop g4, and we've gone through this line already. Aside from that, let's say they don't play queen e2 and waste the tempo. If they go with something like bishop to e2, h5 is a very common defensive idea that just prevents us from losing our very vulnerable queen. If they go with anything else, let's say bishop to e3, we can just go with knight f6, knight c6, bishop to g4, bishop to e7, castle, and we have a strong kingside attack. Moving on, I want to cover the second most common line after knight takes e5, queen f6. So after d4, again, we play d6, kick the knight out of the center, and prepare to win back our pawn. The second most common move from this position, by about 20%, is knight to f3. Knight f3 is a horrendous move, for the simple reason that we take the pawn and now we have tempo on the knight. After queen e2, which is the most common move, pinning our pawn, we have the very simple d5, or alternatively, queen to e7 basically forces knight g1. But of course, d5 is a more natural move, and so you are free to choose whatever you want. After something like knight to e5, we play knight c6. Knight c6 just challenges the knight. And after they take, we play queen g4. This is an actual game that I wanted to show you. Essentially, a lot of the moves in this second line are basically the same as the first one. Of course, here we can play bishop d6, but essentially we're going to get knight f6, castle, and essentially we play chess. This is an actual game that White played. I'm not going to show the full game, although it has been included in the study. But essentially, for the second most common line, a lot of the themes and moves are basically exactly the same, but a slightly better version because we gain the tempo and the knight in the beginning. For example, let's say they don't play knight e5. So they play knight g5. Again, we can just move on with life. Play knight c6. Just to say they play c3, defending the pawn. We can already go h3. And this is a really great position to have. Alternatively, we can go g3, h3, sorry, and queen g6. Do our thing. We have a very good position. And I'd also like you to realize that we're not even down a pawn because we won it back on e4. So this second line with after d4, d6, knight f3 is really bad for white. And frankly speaking, you'll have a great position. So moving forward again, I'm sorry if I'm going too fast, but this is what's considered the refutation of the entire Latvian Gambit. e4, e5, knight f3, f5, knight takes e5, queen f6, d4, d6, same thing we've always seen. And here knight to d3. Knight to d3 is a really, really strange move at first glance, but essentially the point is that after f takes e4, and white plays knight to f4, and essentially the knight on f4 controls the g6 square, so we no longer get queen to g6. Here, I'm recommending this key move, queen to f7. Queen to f7 is essentially, if you don't want me to move my queen, I will move my queen anyway. Queen to f7 has a few ideas. The first thing is that it supports the d5 square and allows us to push d5. So if something like bishop c4, just d5. Actually, no, wait, bishop d5 just loses with it's a previous bishop. My bad. Aside from that, we also again vacate the square for our knight, prepare to move our bishop and castle, and also we are ready to play knight to c6. An alternative here is c6 preparing d5. However, I'm not recommending that because white can play d5, and it's a very messy position that I just don't think you want to engage in. So after knight to f4, I'm recommending queen to f7 again. Same principle. We are moving the queen out of the way so that we can get our knight and bishop out. So after queen to f7, the most common move for white is knight to c3. Knight to c3 is just a normal move, attacking our pawn. We can just go with knight to f6, again defending it, and we're fine. Already, white has shown some really terrible games here. For example, a 2000 rated player played bishop to b5, which is already a mistake. because we get c6. And after bishop to a4, d5, black has a completely playable position. Black is going, gets bishop g4, develops the bishop. And here, please don't castle and lose your bishop on the spot. But again, chess must be played. And so after this, black got a perfectly fine position, liquidated, and eventually mated the king. So I just included this game to show you, just to show you this is mate. And if this, then we have this. Ladder mate. So I just included this game to show you that even in this top engine line, which is supposed to be refuting the Latvian Gambit, your kingside attack just cannot be stopped. There's just so much tactical opportunities for you to throw at your opponent. And if they castle queenside, like I explained just now, you can always go with a6, b5, c6, d5, just throw the whole house at them. Another game I wanted to show you was bishop to e2. Bishop to e2 is a more sane move than bishop to b5, and of course there's not bait c6, d5 with tempo. However, we can just go c6, d5 anyways. The person who played this game did it in a different move order, but essentially c6, d5 is always an option. After bishop to h4, h5, sorry, which is just completely nonsense. The bishop came to d6, which is a more active square. Essentially, after c6, d5 is played, the bishop can come to d6 instead. But of course, bishop to e7 is fine as well. I just included this game to show you how quickly the kingside attack comes. And already, I mean, I ended the game like somewhere around here, but black is completely winning. There's just nothing else to like say about it. Black is completely winning. So even in this like engine line with, you have all these pawn players. I'm not going over these moves in detail because these aren't exactly common ideas. These are very situational plays. But essentially my point is that after d5 and c6, you can get bishop d6, a bishop points at the diagonal. Alternatively, you always have knight c6, you always have bishop e7 castle, put something on f5. You have a very good position. One thing I did want to cover is the second most common move after queen to f7, which is for some reason b3. Oh, sorry, b3. Now the entire point of b3 is to play bishop to c4, even though it does absolutely fuck all. We're gonna go d5 immediately and say, haha, play bishop c4 now. After c4, c6, I mean, takes. I mean, white's just like, what is white doing, you know? We can go bishop to b4 here as someone actually playing a game. We can also go knight f6, perfectly fine. So the game continues very normally, and you see all of our pieces come to their usual squares very quickly. Castles, and I just wanted to include this to show you an example of how the kingside attack can develop in this knight f4 line. g5 is always an idea, and these are just typical attacking ideas, and white just resigned. So that more or less does it for the knight takes e5 top engine line. Again, this is after d4, d6, knight to d3 with the idea of going to knight to f4. In this specific case, I'm recommending, again, queen to f7 instead of queen to g6, because queen to g6 is a queen. After that, we can just get our very standard developments, either with c6, d5, which I do recommend, or with knight to c6 if you really want to play in the center. So let's move on to the other lines for knight takes e5. After this, I'm going to do a quick summary of the knight takes e5 lines. So after e4, e5, knight f3, knight f5. After knight takes e5, queen f6, there are a number of like funny lines. For example, knight to c4 immediately without d4. Now this doesn't really have that much independent value. The entire point is basically instead of playing d4, white wants to play d3, which, okay, cool. We take the pawn, and here I do recommend queen to f7. This is the thing I do want you to remember from this line. Queen g6 is playable, but it's problematic because white gets knight to d5, and it's very difficult for us to defend the square. Now, king d8 is like fine, but I wanted to recommend a line where black didn't have to just move their king on move like 6 for no reason. So I'm recommending queen to f7 for a very simple reason. For one, this pawn is tactically defended because d5 wins a piece. Yeah, oh no, free knight. So here, after d3, we just go with d5. That's the other idea of queen to f7, that we defend d5. And here, queen to f6 is a good move. Again, preparing to meet this threat. So essentially, whenever there's a knight on e5, we want our queen on f6. So after d4, we play c3. You could also play knight c6. Knight c6 is a perfectly fine move. And yeah, there's really not much else to worry about here. This will transpose into some other line. So let's say after knight e3, this is also has been played before. The entire idea is to play bishop to c4. So let's say we make a stupid move, bishop to c4, we lose. We cannot play this. We move the queen, and our position sucks. So the queen e7, bishop never moving, king never castling, we die. So that's obviously problematic. So here, important move, it's not to go knight f6, but to go c6 to play d5. After they take the pawn, we go d5 anyway. Again, queen to f6. And we just get a perfectly fine position. I just wanted to include this to show you that even if for some reason this queen cannot leave f6, the knight on e7 is fine. Okay, like we still get our attack. Yeah. So again, all these tactical ideas mixed together. Move the queen across because it's like there, you might as well move it. And the bishop on this diagonal is attacking the king. On this diagonal, we can always reposition it to this side. Perfectly fine position for black. This is really not a very dangerous sideline that you need to worry about. So aside from that, I also wanted to cover f4, which is this stupid move that has been like tried a few times. Again, we just kick the knight out. What was that? We kick the knight out, we take this, and we are fine. You know, we can actually let them have this pawn, by the way. Let's say we play knight c6, free piece again. So these are really not dangerous lines that you need to pay attention to. I'm just going over them really quickly, and of course you can ask me if you have any questions. Aside from that, there are really not very many sidelines to worry about. So now that we're done with the knight takes e5 lines, let's do a quick summary. So after knight takes e5, we play queen f6. Queen f6 attacks the knight, prepares g6, and just in case they try queen h5. So after that, we are attacking the knight. So the most common move is d4. Again, knight to c4 is really not something you need to worry about. After d4, we play d6, attacking the knight. And now the knight has 3 squares that it can go to. This is really bad because we take it with tempo, and after that, we just get our normal things out. Knight c4 is the most common move, and after we take, it's good to remember this queen g6 motif, defending the pawns in the center and preparing knight to f6 with bishop t7 castles and a kingside attack to follow. Aside from that, the critical refutation of the entire line is knight to d3, because after we take, white intends knight to f4, which controls the g6 square and essentially tries to make it really hard for our pieces to break through. That's perfectly fine. Here we play queen to f7, essentially vacating another square for our knight. And after something like, say, knight to c3, we can of course just go with knight to f6. We're going to develop, get castle, and we have a very okay position. Once we've castled with, let's say, how about bishop to e2, bishop to e7, castles, bishop to e3, knight c6, and after they defend the pawn, we're always going to have ideas of bringing our knight in, or in this case g4, kicking the knight back, and we have a very potent kingside attack. So that more or less does it for the knight takes e5 lines. So now I'm moving on to the second part of the video, which is essentially everything other than knight takes e5. So there are a number of key ideas in the knight takes e5 lines. There's just like e takes f5 for one. There's also bishop to c4, and again there is d3, and we're just going to cover all of those funny things. Let's start with e takes f5. E takes f5 is, aside from like knight takes e5, is like the next best move for white, and essentially white can be winning if white remembers 2000 moves of computer theory, which they are not going to do. So after e takes f5, we go with the typical move e4. Yes. Knight c6 is a funny thing for some Rousseau Gambit players, but I'm not going to recommend that. So after we play e4, white has like 3 moves. Knight to e5, knight to d4, and queen to e2. Only knight to e5 works. Everything else loses on the spot. After knight to d4, which is the most common move, we're going to play knight to f6. Something like d5 is complete crap because after queen h5, we lose like our entire life and soul. So of course, common idea, we play knight to f6. Queen to f6 is like okay, but like why? If you really want, you can play queen f6, but I'm going to recommend knight f6. Defending our pawn, preventing queen to h5. After something like d3, essentially trying to break our grip, we play c5, take d4, and we have a very normal position. Essentially, in this e takes f5 line, because it's not so critical, most of the moves flow really naturally, and you can just get a perfectly fine position. Here d4 threatens d5 threatens c4, so very normal position for black. Aside from, so knight to d4 is nothing to fear. Queen to e2 is also nothing to fear because we go queen e7. We renew the threat on the knight. So the knight has to move, let's say, to d4, because that's the only place. Knight to c6 is the best move. And this is something I need you to remember. Knight to c6. In the event that you really forget and you play something inferior like d5, you can get a playable position, but the problem is we are never going to get compensation for the missing pawn because queens are off the board. So knight to c6 is an important move because knight to c6 immediately challenges the center and just buys us tempo. So after d takes, I prefer d takes because it opens up an attack on the pawn, and there's really no convenient way for white to defend it. After g4, I mean, for one, this is completely fine. After takes, we take, and black is doing fine. After queen to h5, we play this funny king to d8 idea. This is the only line where I will ever recommend king to d8. And the point is, we have compensation. We're going to play knight f6, win back the pawn. And this is following an actual game played by black, where black won a very nice game. The link is, of course, in the study. After knight to c3, rook to e8. This is a very typical position. This has been reached only once, but these typical developing ideas are very common. Bishop to g4 is also fine. But essentially, black gets really good development. And I just wanted to show you this game because in the span of like 2 moves, white went from perfectly fine to dead loss. This is 0-0-0. And in 2 moves, the position is now -4. The moment that white allows black to take an initiative and just create threats every move, like h3 and threatening mate. The moment that white allows black to get initiative, white is losing. So I want you to, when you want to play this opening, I need you to be more attentive to creating threats. You gotta try and create threats every move. The moment that white slows down and isn't creating threats, you start creating threats and you are immediately winning. So queen e2 sucks. Queen e2 is just in general a terrible move because it wastes time. So let's say that instead of queen e2, white plays the critical move, not that. Knight to e5. Knight to e5 has a very obvious threat, queen to h5 again. And here we're going to play knight f6. If the d4 is the most common move, please don't take with en passant. I don't want you taking with en passant because then f5 is very annoyingly defended. So we're gonna go with d6, kick the knight out, win the pawn back. I mean, you have equal material, one extra piece developed, and all of your pieces are coming out. I mean, I cannot get you a better position than this. It's a perfectly fine position. Bishop to e2 is the best move, essentially threatening bishop to e2. This is a funny line that you don't really need to remember, but essentially we're playing d6, and the point is after knight f7 we play this funny move, where white doesn't really have anything better but to trade, and we get two pieces for the rook. Another idea that I wanted to show you is, sorry, not in this chapter, but essentially I wanted to, oh yeah, we're moving on to the bishop c4 idea. So bishop to c4 is a funny little thing that you can play on move, like can try on move 3. You have two options here. You can either take the pawn, which is more Latvian Gambit style, or if you've ever played the Rousseau Gambit, you can play knight c6, which just transposes back into the Rousseau. The only issue with this line is that you're going to have to know what to play after d4. But that's perfectly fine. Let's say I'm not going to go into that because that's not really the scope of this video. Let's say they take on e5, we're just going to go with d5. e5 hits the bishop, of course, preventing the attack on f7. Queen h5 is a critical move. It is the only move for white to maintain equality. If white, let's say, just moves the bishop, immediately we have this queen g4 idea, which hits the knight and the g2 pawn, and also the g2 knight. The knight is trapped. It cannot go anywhere. It dies wherever it goes. Cool? Cool. So this queen g4 idea is a very important thing to idea in basically any line that does not involve knight takes e5 because of this pawn. This pawn controls all the squares on the knight, and essentially that is why we have queen g4 without the knight coming back. So queen to h5 is the only move because it stops this queen g4 idea. We're gonna play g6. After knight takes pawn, please don't go, oh no, my rook. Play knight to f6. Knight to f6 is fine. We hit the queen, so of course if they take, we just win the queen. And if let's say they move, I mean you can take the bishop, they take, you're gonna win this knight back, and essentially you have two pieces for a rook. After queen to f5, we're gonna go here, and this is actually already better for black because again, two pieces for rook. So I'm going to cover next the d3 line, and then we're going to do a summary for all the other moves. So after d3, it's already a horrendous move. We're going to go knight c6. Taking is fine, but this is getting very soft, and you don't want to give white like a free open e5. So I recommend knight to c6, defending it, and essentially our point is, if they take, we are going to play d5, and we have such a great position. You cannot be complaining about this position. We are going to win the pawn back, like by force, and we're going to be fine. Let's say they try not to take the f-pawn, just move on with life. They pin us, we pin them back. And essentially, at some point, they will have to take the pawn, because if you look at white's position, white is out of moves. White has nothing to do. Let's say white castles, I mean, we can take. If you want, you can take here. You can also just play d6, force them to take you. You can also take, play d5 if you want. You can also play h6. A number of options for black here, but essentially no matter what black does, as long as you remember this knight c3 and with the idea of playing waiting for them to take and then playing d5, you will be fine in this line. And yeah, that's really all there is to know about the Latvian Gambit. So let's do one more summary for the other section. The key thing to remember in the other move section is to not be afraid to go sacrifice a rook for two pieces. Generally, if that happens, even then you're like probably fine, if not winning. So as long as you are willing to like lose this rook in exchange for two pieces, as I showed you in both the e takes f5 and bishop c4 lines, you'll be fine. So let's just do a quick summary. After e takes f5, we're going to go with e4. Knight to e5 is the only move, after which we're going to go knight f6, preventing the threat. And after something like d4, we've already got a perfectly fine position. Instead of that, if white tries something like bishop to c4, we take, and we've got this queen g4 idea. Alternatively, if they go with something like queen h5, as I illustrated, please do not be scared to go down a rook for 2 pieces. We are going to just win this piece back by foot, so you'll be fine. Finally, they could try d3, and of course, you just need to remember this critical knight to c6 with the idea of responding to them taking the f-pawn with d5. And that's literally all you need to know about the Latvian Gambit. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you still have any questions about the position, or if I was unclear in any section, you may feel free to leave a comment or ask me. And I've been talking to my computer for 46 minutes, so I'm going to go drink some water and die now. Good night.